The RTX 4060 is quickly becoming one of the most popular options for gamers, but I think that they're all making a big mistake. Most of us already know that certain AMD cards usually provide more FPS per dollar value, but there's even an NVIDIA option that's better than the 4060. Today I'm going to show you 3 alternative GPUs that are either the same price or cheaper than the 4060, and all of them perform even better. And real quickly, since I know my audience is always interested in saving money when building and selling gaming PCs, today's video sponsor GVG Mall can definitely help you out with that. I've worked with GVG Mall for so long now and have bought probably close to 100 keys myself, and they're hooking you all up big time with the 25% off discount if you use code ZTT18 with the link in the description. GVG Mall has Windows activation keys as well as Microsoft Office, game keys for platforms like Steam and Origin, and they even have console stuff too like PSN and Xbox prepaid cards. Activating Windows couldn't be easier. Just paste in the key that you get instantly after paying on the website, so remove that ugly unactivated watermark for good. Don't forget to use ZTT18 for 25% off with the link in the description. There is something that I'm leaving out in this video, and you may have mixed feelings about it, so let me state my case. We will not be testing some of the quote benefits of an NVIDIA graphics card, such as ray tracing performance, upscaling with DLSS, reflex technology, or the streaming encoder. Make no mistake, I do realize that some of those do actually provide value, such as if you're a content creator, I am always recommending NVIDIA no matter what. However, most of these features, like ray tracing, I don't think are super relevant because I honestly don't believe most people are buying an RTX 4060 for ray tracing. Sure, there are some titles out there that could allow you to dabble with it and see some beautiful puddle reflections and shadows, but in reality, you're probably going to turn that off after 5 minutes so you can go back to the higher frame rates. Today's video is strictly focusing on straight up 1080p gaming performance, no ray tracing or upscaling, because I think that's what most people are actually interested in. If you look at the Steam charts or the games that are popular on Twitch right now, most people aren't playing games that really flex a GPU's tensor cores and upscaling potential, but rather they're just playing games like Fortnite, Once Human, and First Descendant, which just came out recently. That's the type of testing that we're going to be doing, so let's jump into it. Here's the testing rig that we're going to be using today, and this should give us a nice even playing field for all 4 of our graphics cards. The CPU is a Ryzen 5 7600X, which is a perfect mid-ranged option for our all mid-range GPUs. And the RAM is actually new in our testing rig, and this is the Clev Crass 5 RGB, which is a 32GB DDR5 kit clocked all the way up to 7200 megahertz. Shout out to them for sending this over to boost both the performance and the aesthetics of our testing rig. I'm definitely a fan of this minimal all black design on the sides and then a simple and clean RGB strip at the top. These sticks are rocking a high quality aluminum heatsink to keep those temperatures nice and cool, especially at these higher clock speeds. They're only 44 millimeters in height too, which is great for cooler compatibility. I'll have a link to these down in the description. The other new addition to our testing rig is the brand new Antec C7 ARGB, and honestly, I'm in love with this case, but we'll talk about that at the end of the video because we got to get back to these GPUs. Here's the 3 other options that we'll be testing, and before we jump straight into the FPS numbers, I want to quickly touch on power requirements, VRAM, and price. To make this as even as possible, I'm looking at these comparisons as 2 different sets. The first set compares the RTX 4060 against AMD's brand new option, and then the second set are 2 used options, and one of them is NVIDIA and one of them is AMD. Sorry, Intel, we'll get to you in a comparison next time. So the RTX 4060's direct competitor on the new market is AMD's RX 7600 XT. You can find these brand new for around $300, but usually $310 on average, which makes it about just $20 higher than the 4060. Now the kicker though is that the 7600 XT has a whopping 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is exactly double what the 4060 has. This obviously doesn't translate to double the amount of performance or anything, but in a VRAM demanding gaming landscape that we're in right now, it's pretty important. VRAM is the one stat on the spec sheet that can help determine how long your card will last for, because over the years, new games coming out are requiring more and more of it. It wasn't that long ago that 4 gigabytes of VRAM was good enough, but now we're already at the point where 8 gigabytes of VRAM is actually a downside to a graphics card. It's honestly probably the biggest disadvantage to the 4060 right now, in my opinion. Now, the second set of GPUs are the used options, and here's how they stack up against each other. First is AMD's RX 6700 XT, and before the RX 7000 series came out, this was one of the most valued GPUs on the entire market. It's borderline a 1440p card as it is, and at its $250 used average price on eBay, that's still some incredible value. This makes it about $40 cheaper than the RTX 4060, but that's of course not an apples to apples comparison because it's new versus used. Now, you can actually find an occasional RX 6700 XT on the new market for like $300, but they don't always sit there because it's a generation old, and I personally think that the people that are interested in this card are most likely interested in it because of its used price. And that same thing can be said about our NVIDIA option, and this is the RTX 3070. Whenever you're hunting for a used graphics card, you gotta remember and think back to what were the most popular GPUs whenever that generation was the newest. Before the RTX 4000 series came out, the RTX 3070 was one of the most popular GPUs on the planet, and at one point after the GPU shortage, it was actually providing some pretty decent value. Fast forward a couple years though, and a lot of those owners are selling their 3070s to upgrade to 4000 series, so the used marketplaces are absolutely flooded with 3070s. You can easily find these for about $275 on average, at least here in the United States, and at the time of writing, I saw several of these on Jawa and even eBay for cheaper than that. But we are still unfortunately affected by the VRAM stinginess of NVIDIA because the RTX 3070 still only has 8 gigabytes, just like the 4060. Here's a quick chart so you can see these comparisons all side by side. I also included the minimum recommended power supply wattage, and it's all pretty close to each other. Again, I prefer if you frame this competition as the RTX 4060 versus the 7600 XT if you're interested in buying new, and then the 6700 XT versus the 3070 if you want to buy used. Every option here can obviously compete with the 4060 since that's the purpose of the video, but I do understand that some of you might not want to buy used, or some people might not want to buy AMD. If you only want to buy a new card, then keep your eye out on the performance for the RX 7600 XT, and if you don't want to buy AMD, keep your eye out on the RTX 3070 performance. No matter how you look at it or what GPU buying methodology you use, all three of these alternative options are going to have a compelling reason to go with them over the 4060, but let's start running those performance numbers ourselves to check it out. And just remember that the exact model of these cards isn't super important. There is indeed a slight difference in the cooling and clock speeds from model to model, but we're mainly focused on the GPU series in a video like this, so don't stress too much about that. First up, we'll test some CAN benchmarks because that's the best way to get consistent data across different hardware. We'll start with 3D Mark's TimeSpy, and here's how all four cards stacked up against each other. Head to head, the new RX 7600 XT did deliver a slightly higher score than the 4060, and then our two used options significantly outscored both of those. Remember though, the benchmarks of a used graphics card versus a new one is definitely not really fair, but if anything, it does highlight the reason of why us enthusiasts do usually recommend buying a used graphics card. The RX 6700 XT costs 40 to 50 bucks less than a brand new 4060 here, but it's also performing about 15% better. That's a crazy swing in FPS per dollar value. Next up is 3D Mark's Steel Nomad, which is just their latest benchmark, and here we're seeing a bit different of a result. We still have the same score progression with the RTX 4060 being the lowest, and then the 7600 XT slightly above that, but for some reason the 6700 XT just got about 100 points above that, but then the 3070 skyrocketed. This is too new of a benchmark for me to know the answer to that one, but maybe someone down in the comment section can explain it. Now we'll jump into some gaming, and since Once Human is one of the most popular games on Steam right now, we'll start with that one. We cranked the settings up to 1080p very high, and here are the results. The RTX 4060 just slightly beat out the RX 7600 XT this time, and then about 20 FPS above that, we have the 6700 XT and RTX 3070 competing against each other. Another popular brand new title is First Descendant. Here the results are about evenly distributed across the board. The RTX 4060 did perform the worst, but the 6700 XT performed the best, but it didn't really beat the other two cards by much. After that, we have Helldivers 2, which isn't as popular as it once was, but it's still a good GPU benchmarking game in my opinion. With 1080p ultra settings, the 4060 is again on the bottom, and then there's a slight progression going through the cards yet again. Here's X Define in 1080p ultra, and again, the 4060 is well towards the bottom here. At 118 FPS, that puts the RX 6700 XT improvement at a massive 50% increase, which is pretty wild considering you can snag it for much cheaper. And finally, the last game we'll deep dive on is Cyberpunk 2077, and here the 4060 is again directly competing with the 7600 XT and losing by a little bit. We also have the 3070 outperforming the 6700 XT at about 20 frames higher than our newer options. Here's the rest of the games that we tested, and I'll just give you our full Notion database screenshot here. The first number on the left side is the average FPS, and then the second number to the right is the 1% low. We'll notice here that other than a few outliers like Fortnite, which is admittedly really tough to test consistently from card to card, we're seeing about the same thing as we did before. The RX 7600 XT performs a few frames higher than the 4060 on average, but then the 6700 XT and 3070 perform a significant amount better, and they're usually pretty close to each other. Now, in my opinion, there's two major takeaways to take from all that data, and one of them may actually surprise you guys. The first one's obvious, and that's if you want to achieve the most FPS per dollar value, then on the new market, the RX 7600 XT is the way to go. It performs better than the 4060 in almost every single title, plain and simple, and it's rocking double the amount of VRAM, which is great for the next few years. And yes, just as a reminder, reminder, in case you skipped over the beginning part of the video, we're of course not talking about ray tracing, DLSS, the encoder, and other NVIDIA specific features here. Now, the other takeaway, which again, this might be a surprise to you, is that in my opinion, the RTX 4060 is just not that bad. It is definitely not bad enough to judge somebody for choosing to go with this card. Sure, it doesn't perform as good as the 7600 XT, but it's not like a landslide by any stretch of the imagination. As this card continues to go down in price, the card becomes more and more of an attractive option, and it's definitely not worth the hate that our community gives the 4060, or at least not nearly as much as when it first launched. Now again though, I do think the 8 GB of VRAM is the most limiting factor, and I think you'll feel that in 2 years from now if you're still on a 4060, which is why my personal recommendation would still be the 7600 XT new or the 6700 XT used. Both of these have a significant more amount of VRAM, and they perform better in terms of FPS per dollar value, and the 6700 XT is much cheaper than the 4060. The 4060 also gets a lot of hate because we see PC building rookies pairing them with Intel i7s and Ryzen 7s. If you're building a straight up gaming PC, I recommend using either an Intel i5 or a Ryzen 5 to balance it out. Personally, I think a 7500F from AliExpress at like $120 to $130 would be a perfect combination, but if you only want to buy from Amazon or Newegg, then get a Ryzen 5 7600 for the RTX 4060. With all that data, definitely let me know what card you'd pick if you were in the market for one of these mid-range GPUs. I definitely want to hear from you guys. Now, I do want to go back to this testing case because I actually love this Antec C7 ARGB. This is part of their new Constellation series, and honestly, I think it's one of the cleanest looking fish tanks on the entire market. I really like how instead of being dual chambered, we're getting a minimal and tiny PSU basement that actually has a good aesthetic design to it, and technically it's actually meant to increase airflow a bit as well. The 4 included ARGB PWM fans also definitely help with that, and I love how these are all hooked up to an included PWM and ARGB hub in the back. You can also fit 2 360mm radiators here if you wanted to go a little crazy, and I'll have a link to this along with everything else we talked about today down in the description. Big thanks to Antec and Clev for sending out their upgrades to our testing rig, and I hope this video provided some value to you if you're shopping for mid-range GPUs. If you are still on the fence about which one to buy, then I do offer one-on-one help with my consulting services at ztthelp.com. We also just posted some performance build guide templates totally for free at zttbuildhelp.com. Just as a heads up, you obviously will not be finding the RTX 4060 on any of those lists though. And finally, don't forget to comment down below again about which GPU you would go with, and feel free to click the video that's on the screen now if you want to see what other video YouTube recommends that you watch next.